Bible study for you who don't go to a Bible study or don't have access to one. And so I'd like to start a little bit by talking about Luke and who he was. Probably the only author in the Bible who's not Jewish. He was a Gentile. He was a friend of Paul's. They traveled together on some of Paul's missionary journeys. Luke is said to be a physician, a doctor. So he would have been educated probably in Greek schools of medicine and in the Greek temples of healing. He was a very, very intelligent man, and he was a very engaging writer. He also wrote the book of Acts because his intention was to tell the entire story of Jesus from the time before his birth until the time of Paul's ministries and Paul's journeys throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. When I know I've mentioned this before, that Luke and Matthew have a lot of very similar stories. They probably kind of borrowed from each other. They borrowed from Mark, and they had other sources that they tapped into to tell their stories of Jesus. Matthew is Jewish, and the purpose for him telling his story was to talk about the redemption of the Jewish people. And his had more of I want to say this, but he had more of a spiritual aspect to it. Not that Luke's gospel isn't spiritual, but Luke was hoping to tell a story from kind of a broader perspective. A story that he hoped would be relevant not only to the Jewish people, but to the Gentiles as well, because he was a Gentile. And he probably wrote with a deep understanding of where the Gentile mind is and how the Gentile mind would best receive the story of Jesus as the Christ. And a few little comparisons here. Matthew's story of the birth begins with a genealogy that starts with Abraham. He says that Jesus was the son of Joseph, who was a son of Abraham. So even though Jesus' real father, as it were, God, Matthew had a need to set the birth and the personhood of Jesus within the Jewish line, okay? Luke is a little more universalist than this, and he tells the genealogy too, but he takes the genealogy all the way back to Adam. And if you remember, Adam and Eve had children. They had a son who killed his brother and was banished and had to go live elsewhere. And there would be a line of people from Cain and other lines from children and grandchildren, okay? So Luke is seeking to make Jesus relevant to the entire world by taking Jesus' genealogy clear back to the very, very beginning, which is where all people came from, in the very beginning. So there's universality there. Matthew tells the story of Jesus from the point of view of Joseph. Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant, and so he's resolving that to save face for both of them, they will divorce very quietly, and she'll just go her way and he'll go his. And then he receives a visit from an angel telling him, this is what's going on. Mary is pregnant by God, by the Holy Spirit, and you are going to be the child's father and responsible for his upbringing, okay? In Luke, the story is a bit more complex, and it's focused so fully on the women. Luke's story, again, is much more complete, because he talks about the birth of John the Baptist and Zechariah and Elizabeth, John's parents, who were quite old. And again, this is a very old Hebrew storytelling mechanism. God's miraculous spiritual presence is often experienced through women who are old and barren. Women who have not been able to bear children, and at some level feel quite outcast from their community because of this. And God's blessing, the presentation of God's blessed people is through barren women. Mary is also, she and Joseph are, for the most part, they're engaged. They're engaged. And when we hear from Matthew that Joseph has to divorce her, it's a legal agreement, the engagement, and it has to end for Joseph, is what he's thinking. Mary is the focus of the angels. And Mary tells that brilliant proclamation that we sang in the beginning of our service. Maybe at some point go back into that hymn and read those words through. It's such a gorgeous retelling of the Magnificat. At about 6 months, Mary goes to visit her cousin, who is Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. Okay? And so you have this connectivity of the women in this story. Women figure very prominently in Luke's story because he comes from a Greek background, and women have a stronger role in society, in Greek society. Okay? Luke's is also a gospel of justice, more so than Matthew. When Matthew takes Jesus to the Mount, in Matthew, Jesus stands above his disciples and his apostles and the multitudes, and he preaches down to them, and we call that the Sermon on the Mount. Luke puts Jesus kind of at the bottom of the hill, so that the hillside is like an amphitheater, so people can go up and they can all have a view of Jesus. Whereas in Matthew, Jesus goes up the mountain so they can all look up at him. Here, they all look down to him. That's the nature of his accessibility, as told by the Greek Gentile physician, Luke. I think that's probably why Luke often has a stronger resonance for seminary students. At least that was my experience. Luke was much more universalist. Luke was much more justice-oriented. And I was in seminary in the 80s. And there was a very strong sort of wave of consciousness in the seminaries, what was the justice ministry of the church. And Luke, this was so confirmed, saw in the hymn this morning, in Mary's Magnificat, saw Jesus as the overthrower of the kingdoms of humanity. Kingdoms of the powerful who would use their power to overtake the humble and the poor. Okay? Jesus was the one who stood and looked up to the humble and the poor and the masses. He was the one who met people of other faiths, people of other backgrounds. And never once saw him as different from his Jewish family, his Jewish community. Again, this universality of the Christ and his ministry in our world. Which is why we have missionaries today, which was why we have people around the world that feed, that nourish, that heal, that give hope to the poor, the downtrodden, the hungry, the thirsty. when Jesus speaks his Beatitudes, he puts a spiritual aspect to it. For example, when he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." That's what he says. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Luke says now, "Blessed are the poor." Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who hunger. Blessed are those who are overthrown. Blessed are those who live close to the earth, who live close to the ground, not because they live off of it purely, but because they are under the boot of the oppressor, which is why he stood at the bottom of the hill and spoke up to those who would listen. Blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who are hungry. Matthew says, "Blessed are you who hunger and thirst for righteousness." Luke's Jesus says, "Blessed are hungry people." People who are hungry and have not enough food. Because in the reign of God announced by Jesus Christ, the poor will have rights. The poor will be fed and nourished. And as we saw in the story, before he even said a word, he was healing people. All he had to do was stand there and let the power flow. As it said, people would just touch his garment and be healed. So when finally he was talking, people could believe. They could believe because they had seen it right there. They watched people being healed. They watched people's lives change just by touching. Just by touch. It's such a remarkable story. And I would invite you all to maybe some point, when you have a day with absolutely nothing else to do, is sit down with Matthew, sit down with Luke, kind of read them side by side. Read the stories, read the parables, read the biography of Jesus and his disciples, and the places they traveled and the things they did. It's the same story, but it's told in such different ways. And for Luke, Jesus is the world about to turn. And that for generations beyond, far beyond what Luke could see, far beyond what Paul could see, Jesus would remain as the power of transformation. Not just the transformation of souls, but the transformation of governments, the transformation of systems of power and privilege. The world is about to turn. Now, we've been saying this for over 2,000 years. But if you consider that the universe probably came into being around 14 billion years ago, and consider how old the planet actually is, in the millions, 2,000, not a big time. Not a big time. And also, we have the church that carries the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of transformation, the Spirit of healing, the Spirit of beatitude, carried forward and forward and forward and forward, generation after generation, through all of the ages and all of the stages and all of the times of kings, and the times of dictators, and the times of presidents, and the times of prime ministers. Drops in the bucket, mere drops in the bucket. The rivers of life are eternal. The movement of spirit is eternal, and it never ends. And Luke points us to the one man who turned the tide and said, instead of this, it will be this. Instead of this, it will be this. Instead of despair, poverty, hunger, there will be fullness of life, fullness of spirit, and the fullness of creation, restored, renewed, transformed by the power of God expressed through us when we stand at the humble place and we send our voices upward and we send our hands outward. And we are then the transformation of the world. Amen.